Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's meeting on the struggle for freedom in Iran. My name is Shireen, and I'll be moderating today's event. This meeting comes after nearly 3 months of uprising across Iran after the death of Jina Amini, a Kurdish woman killed at the hands of Iran's morality police. This uprising has been the largest in Iran since the 1979 revolution. But at the same time, the US left has not paid much attention to the ongoing revolt. So this event will discuss how the uprising came about and the dynamics at hand. Today's meeting is sponsored by Tempest Collective, New Politics, and Internationalism from Below. Today's event will be live streamed on Facebook, but folks watching there will have to come onto the Zoom to join the discussion after the initial presentations. We have 3 speakers today. The first will be Frieda Afary, who's an Iranian American librarian, translator, and writer. She's the author of Socialist Feminism, A New Approach, published in 2022 by Pluto Press. She also produces Iranian Progressives in Translation and socialistfeminism.org. Fred, our second speaker, is an Iranian writer living in the US. And our third speaker will be Danny Postel, who's the author of Reading Legitimation Crisis in Tehran and the co-editor of The People Reloaded, The Green Movement and the Struggle for Iran's Future. He's a member of Internationalism from Below and politics editor of New Lines magazine. His recent article, The Other Regional Counter-Revolution, Iran's Role in the Shifting Political Landscape of the Middle East, dismantles the fiction of the Islamic Republic as a, quote, revolutionary state in the vanguard of a region's axis of resistance. So without further ado, I'll give it off to Frieda.
Thank you so much, Shireen. And thank you to Tempest, New Politics, and Internationalism from Below. It's a pleasure to speak to you. I have about 9 minutes to give an introduction. So I just wanted to let you know in advance that there's so much more to talk about that I'm hoping that questions in the discussion will bring out, and others too. There was comments by Danny and Fred. Iran has been the site of, I would say, the most forward-looking of the anti-authoritarian mass uprisings or protests that we have seen in the past few years. And I'm saying forward-looking because the fact that women are taking off their hijabs, are opposing the mandatory hijab, and I want to clarify, they're not opposing any woman who has a hijab. They're saying it has to be a right to choose to decide whether you want to wear the hijab or not. But the fact that this uprising is being led by women who are fighting for bodily autonomy against the enforcement of the mandatory dress code hijab rule. And the fact that it is also showing signs of deep opposition to the death penalty and to, in general, violence. State and gender violence is really, really very significant. And that's why I think it is the most forward-looking of the uprisings that we've had in the past few years. And some of them, of course, are ongoing uprisings as we speak right now. For instance, Myanmar is having, has continued to have a mass uprising. And hardly anybody talks about that. And of course, Ukraine, I would say, is an uprising against Russia's genocidal invasion. I just want to give you a few of the basic facts about the current uprising. That it involves the whole nation. It involves not just large cities, but small cities and rural areas. So although it doesn't have the simultaneous presence of millions of people in one place, as we saw, for instance, in the Green Movement in 2009 against the fraudulent election, it does have tens of thousands together at one time in various cities. And it involves, of course, women in the forefront, and it involves the Kurds, and the Baluch and the Arabs and the Azeris were the national minorities in Iran. And it involves workers and other labor unions, such as teachers union, and also the unions or associations of doctors and nurses. So it's not only industrial workers, but also service workers involved in it. And of course, students. The average age of the participants is 15. So you have not only women in the forefront, you have young women, you have teenagers in the forefront, taking over their schools, throwing out their principals, taking over college cafeterias, trying to desegregate them, because college cafeterias, of course, are segregated by gender. And so far, there have been at least 18,000 arrested by the state, at least 450 killed by the, these are facts reported by two different human rights, Iranian opposition human rights organizations. There are, there's been one publicized execution this past week of the 23-year-old young man, Mohsen Shekari, who was convicted because they said that he injured a member of the Basij militia, which is really the government's goon squads that go around and beat people up. They said that he injured, he didn't kill, he injured a member of the Basij militia in Tehran. And he blocked a road. Those were the two charges. And they gave him the death sentence for that. They put him in jail for less than 2 months, actually a month and, less than 2 months. And then they executed him this past week. And the government itself announced that it has at least 5 others that it's going to execute. According to some of these human rights organizations, there are anywhere from 16 to 21 people who have received convictions that would lead to the death penalty. And the conviction, the charge is called Muharebe, which means that you're an enemy of God, which that's what it means technically. In Iranian law, it means that you've taken up arms to kill others. But of course, as we know, and as we have seen, it's the state that has killed people in this uprising. It's the state that is shooting people with metal pellets and live ammunition. And according to CNN, women are being, and also men are being raped in prisons. And this is also not a new phenomenon in Iran. Since the Iranian Revolution was transformed into its opposite, counter-revolution in after 1979, this has been one of the practices of the Islamic Republic, that they rape women and they rape men in prisons. So I want to say in the, how many more minutes? I have 4 more minutes, correct? Okay, so in the 4 minutes I have left, I just want to say a little bit more about the multidimensionality of the protests and the international solidarity. So the 4 main forces, as I mentioned, in these protests have been women and national minorities and students and workers. And some people have called the current uprising a feminist revolution. And I'm very sympathetic to that designation. The only way I would qualify that is to say that it has the potential for a feminist revolution because it has some very significant feminist dimensions, but it's not a feminist revolution yet, in the sense that we haven't seen the full-fledged uprising against all the gender norms that we would characterize as patriarchal. But it has some very significant feminist dimensions, in the sense that, as I mentioned, for instance, the desegregation effort to desegregate the cafeterias, a statement by Baluch women, who are really the most oppressed and the most marginalized part of the population of Iran in the southeast of Iran by Pakistan and Afghanistan. And they are expressing some very feminist demands, including demanding the rights of the LGBT community and challenging the patriarchy of the Baluch leaders and saying that the Baluch leaders should not be trusted, and they've been collaborating with the regime, and they're sexist and they're misogynist and opposing rape and the dehumanization of women in Iranian society and in the Baluch community in particular. And one other really significant feminist dimension, I say, would be the fact that the mother of an Iranian worker who was killed in prison 10 years ago, Iranian worker blogger, she went on in front of a video and in public and took off her hijab and said that she supported the uprising and she would not accept any religion that is forced upon people. So that's been a major component of this uprising. And we've also had the fact that the very explicit participation of the Kurds. Of course, Jina Mahsa Armini, as you know, was Kurdish and was visiting Tehran. She lived in Sanandaj, was visiting Tehran. We've had the participation of the Baluch, our Arab minority, national minority, and the Azeris, all demanding an end to the regime and also demanding their rights. So this is something that I hope people ask me more about in the Q&A, the issue of national minorities in Iran and how that has been addressed or lack thereof. And then the students, they're demanding an end to the regime, but also very explicitly challenging any type of ideological system of education and saying that they want the right to think freely and to have debates and to have discussion. And they do not consider education under the Islamic Republic to be true education because it's full of dogma pushed into people's heads, and they just will not accept that anymore. And then the workers, and then I'll say a couple of things about workers' participation and international solidarity, and then I'll end. We've had significant labor participation. I mean, as far as strikes are concerned, it's really important to say that the petrochemical workers had two attempts to go on strike, one in early October, one in late October. And in early October, they started the strike, but then 250 workers were arrested and the strike was broken. Late October, even before they could start the strike, they were assaulted and arrested. And of those 250 people who are arrested, most of them are still in prison. Nevertheless, the petrochemical workers, especially the ones who don't have permanent jobs but have temporary jobs, they've been issuing statements opposing the regime, demanding women's rights, demanding the rights of minorities. These are significant issues because they're not just talking about bread and butter issues. They're talking about political freedom, gender issues, and issues involving discrimination against national minorities. This is something we've been begging for many years, and it's happening. And we've had strikes by teachers. We've had gatherings or protests by healthcare workers opposed to the deaths and not only horrible working conditions, but the fact that protesters who go to prison, who go to hospitals, are then arrested in hospitals. Instead of being allowed to get treatment, they're arrested. And the healthcare staff are not willing to put up with that. And then, of course, truck drivers. So I could talk about that too in the discussion if you'd like to ask me further questions. So we've had significant labor participation. And then finally, as far as international solidarity goes, I think that too has been really significant. Of course, the Iranian diasporic community has been very active in organizing demonstrations, and they've organized some large ones, both in Europe and in the United States, especially Europe. In Berlin had a demonstration with about 80,000 people, organized by an Iranian doctor in Canada, who's also a writer, who lost his wife and child when the Iran shot down a Ukrainian plane when Iran was taking revenge against the US for the missile assassination of the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Qasem Soleimani. So in that revenge act, Iran shot down this Ukrainian plane, which had over 100 Iranian passengers, and his wife and child were on that. So he's organized some major demonstrations. And then finally, we've had expressions of solidarity from China. In the latest protest against the COVID lockdowns in China, solidarity with Iran was mentioned, especially solidarity with Iranian women, and that's very significant. Ukrainian feminists have issued a statement in solidarity with Iranian uprising and Iranian women. And Palestinian intellectuals, a group of Palestinian intellectuals issued a statement saying that they will not accept Hamas using, or rather the Iranian government using the Palestinian cause to promote itself when it's killing its own people. And so they said they're with the Iranian struggle. I will stop at this point. Thank you for the time you gave.
Thank you so much, Frieda. Fred, are you prepared to go next?
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to basically base my talk today on the article I wrote for Tempest about a month ago, When Iran is Free. My focus on the article was about different ideological positions within the movement, and maybe like to attempt to think about some of the weaknesses in the movement. I think there's no doubt, as Frieda mentioned, that this movement comes out of the struggles over the past 5 or 6 years. Essentially, like every year, there has been large waves of struggles and strikes in Iran. As far as the strikes go, there were the strikes of massive strikes of oil workers last summer. Before that, sugarcane workers, steel workers, Tehran bus drivers, and of course, amongst the most organized working class section of the Iran are teachers, who've been organizing and protesting for years. And we've also had massive explosions, like the one that's happening now, but also the wave of protests along with other countries right before COVID in 2019, known as the Bloody Aban, where when over just 1 week, the government killed 1,500 people. And that's sort of an interesting difference that I'm gonna come back to. So what's been terrifying about the current uprising is the number of children, well, literally children, that they've killed. But in Bloody Aban, 1,500 were killed in a week. And in this protest, maybe we've gotten up to 500 in around about 3 months, but definitely more. So this is a difference I'm going to come back to, because I think it's revealing of sort of the differences between the two protests. What I'm going to talk about now are 3, and there are more, but 3 sort of ideological positions that are struggling in the movement. The first one is the liberal opposition. And at least when I wrote, this was sort of the dominant ideology within the movement. It's less so now, but still very dominant, partly because it's an ideology propagated by a lot of TV channels that people watch at home, such as Manoto, BBC Farsi, VOA, Iran International, which is like one of the most popular ones. And the sort of ideas propagated is that the movement that we have is everything. There is not much need for economic or political theorizing. Daily protests are enough. We know what we want, right? Our demands are very clear. We want the overthrow of the Iranian regime, which is absolutely true. That's what many people want and are demanding. But that's all we want. We also know the sort of alternative that we want, right? It's essentially a vision of Western bourgeois democracy, that we want basic freedoms for everyone and a well-functioning economy. That's sort of the view that's presented. They don't put forward any specific leader. Sometimes they flirt with Reza Pahlavi, who has some support from inside Iran. But of course, in a lot of protests and videos, you hear people chanting against Pahlavi as they do against Khamenei. Of course, those videos are never shown by this side of the media, right? But they've also been supporting and growing others, such as Hamed Esmailion, who was sort of a big face behind organizing the Berlin protests last month, where thousands of Iranians gathered in Berlin. And another key aspect of this sort of ideological side is that it's a refusal of any kind of leadership, that we don't want any leaders, we don't want any main organizers, people will just take over themselves. And also that we don't necessarily need any type of independent working class institutions, similar to like councils or Soviets. All that's needed, again, is for people to come out to the streets every day until the regime falls. And I think this perspective, which again, in my view, has been very influential, particularly over the students, sort of presents this sort of false narrative that the regime is like always is about to fall, only one more day of protests, and we're done. Of course, the opposition to this perspective has been from many left channels. These include in Farsi, critique of political economy, or Naqd Iqtisad Siyasi in Farsi, Naqd, which means critique, Slinger Collective, which is the English version of another one called Manjanik, and many others. More popular left news channels are Akhbar Roz, Radio Zamaneh. These channels, again, mostly communicate with people through Instagram posts, Twitter, and Telegram, which is an app similar to WhatsApp that is very popular in Iran because the government cannot control it. So it's definitely a place where people communicate, they get their news. And they've been trying to sort of oppose this ideology coming from the liberal opposition by emphasizing the importance and significance of councils and the establishment of an infrastructure of resistance. So councils, Soviets, they've tried to oppose this notion that there are no need for leaders. Of course, there is an understanding that no one wants leaders from outside, because there are some lefty groups that people very much dislike, who are sitting in the West and always attempt to have leadership of whatever happens within Iran, and people really do hate them. And that's actually like a basis for the liberal opposition to talk about this, to take this anti-leadership position, because they know this sort of sentiment within Iran. But of course, leadership is significant, and in the absence of it, actually, the liberal opposition created these sort of groups called the Youth of Tehran or the Youth of Isfahan or the Youth of Marivan, that in my view are these are like entities in the internet. In my view, they're clearly created by the liberal opposition from the West, but they pretend to be like Iranian youth and sort of take and they take leadership over the movement, right? So the left has been trying to counter them. Also, another thing that the left has put forward to give direction to the movement has been an emphasis on freeing political prisoners, right? That's where the energy should be. The reason for that is that the government very consciously has been imprisoning political leaders, has been imprisoning students who've always taken like leadership positions, such as Leila, Yashar, and others, who are radical sort of socialist student leaders. Radical workers and worker leaders have been imprisoned. And all of these have been targeted arrests. These are not people who've been arrested in the streets, right? These are people who have been targeted because they have these leadership positions, right? So many of these people are in prison. So it's sort of a demand has been, we need to free them in order to empower the movement. And lastly, since I'm running out of time and we can sort of explore these more, all right, I'm gonna wrap up in a couple of minutes. Lastly, it's sort of the Iranian working class. And here maybe like, I wanna present a little bit of a different picture than Frieda did. In my view, I actually don't think the working class has been as involved, particularly not the organized working class. So when we think about the Iranian working class, this is very similar to many other parts of the world, where you have to think of the vast majority of workers being informal workers, contract workers, workers with temporary contracts that sometimes it's just days. Many of them work in very small workshops with like less than 50 or sometimes even just 10 workers, right? And then so vast majority, temporary contracts, terrible working conditions. They live in slums, horrible living conditions. And then you also have a sector that is mostly government workers. These are more formal employment, like main workers in like, let's say, oil, gas. They have been always far less involved in struggles, and they are the ones that can have the most economic impacts. They have longer contracts. Most of them are sort of more skilled workers, and they have better working conditions and better living conditions. Again, some of the most active workers, and these are most active sort of radical workers, have been teachers. They have a Telegram channel with around 30,000 members, which is huge. There are sugarcane workers in Haftepe, and steel workers, also bus drivers. As Frieda mentioned, there has been sort of attempts to go on strike, maybe a day or two, but there hasn't been anything more than that, right? And if you look at their Telegram channels, you can see a little bit of a critical perspective towards the movement. For example, the sugarcane workers and the teachers have, and also the bus drivers, have been very much focused on councils and their institutions. And they're trying to sort of, in my view, they're trying to tell the movement that just going to the street is not enough, that we need to create our institutions. And another thing that they've been emphasizing is also freeing political prisoners. Like they're asking the movement to have its directions towards freeing political prisoners, particularly because many of their own leaders are in prisons. So I do think if the movement is to be revolutionary, and I'll wrap up here, or if to go through a revolutionary direction, it needs to create a better connection between the Iranian labor movement, the simple struggle for bread, that is a big concern, but with the struggle for freedom. And I think there is a little bit of a disconnect there, but I'll wrap up there.
Thank you. That was very helpful, Fred. Danny, you'll be our last speaker.
Thank you very much. Shireen, thanks to the Tempest Collective and New Politics Magazine for hosting this discussion, this very important forum. I'm going to take a slightly different angle, and rather than looking at the internal dynamics within Iran, I want to look at how Iran's foreign policy in the Middle East, how its regional politics are themselves reflect the counter-revolutionary nature of the Islamic Republic. And this is an attempt to challenge the myth, a sadly pervasive myth, including in many quarters of the left, the myth of Iran as a so-called revolutionary state in the vanguard of a regional axis of resistance to US imperialism or to Western hegemony. This fiction of Iran as a revolutionary state is a classic instance of what the late sociologist Ulrich Beck called a zombie category. For Beck, zombie categories are dead, but somehow go on living, making us blind to the realities of the world. And I argue that this view of Iran as a revolutionary state has been dead for a very long time, and yet it somehow stumbles along and blinds us to what's actually happening on the ground in the Middle East. And so what I do in this article that I published in New Politics last year that tackles this fairly thoroughly is I go through 3 case studies. I look at Iran's response to the 2019 uprisings in Lebanon and Iraq, and I look at Iran's response to the Syrian uprising that started in 2011. And I show how, when you actually look at Iran's role in those 3 uprisings, what you get is a very different picture, not one of Iran as a revolutionary force, but rather of a decidedly counter-revolutionary force. Now, I don't have time to go into tremendous detail here in this brief set of comments, but I'd be happy to go into more detail in the discussion period if people are interested. I'll just say very briefly, starting with Syria in 2011, the key thing to remember about Iran's role is that the official Iranian narrative about its role in Syria is that it was simply fighting the war on terror, specifically the war on extremist jihadi Islamists and Salafi fundamentalists. This is Iran's official justification for its intervention on behalf of the Assad regime. But what's important to remember about that is that Iran really started pushing this narrative after 2014 and 15 with the rise of ISIS and the proliferation of jihadi groups across Syria, like Jabhat al-Nusra and others. And after the conflict in Syria had become saturated with so many of these groups, it became a very convenient narrative for the Islamic Republic to say, well, you see, we're just on the side of the Syrian government against these murderous jihadis. But what this narrative belies and conceals is the fact that Iran was on the side of the Assad regime well before there were any jihadis, before there was an ISIS, before there was Al-Qaeda. In those first 8, 9, 10 months of the Syrian uprising, starting in March 2011, you had a democratic, largely nonviolent, non-sectarian cross-section of Syrian society represented in these massive popular demonstrations that rocked the country from top to bottom. And the Assad regime's response to those peaceful, democratic, popular protests can be summed up in, I think, the phrase live ammunition. It simply opened fire on demonstrators, unarmed demonstrators. It arrested and detained thousands, tortured and mutilated and disappeared many of them. And the Islamic Republic of Iran was not only rhetorically on the side of the Assad regime as it was doing this to, again, not to jihadis or Islamic extremists, but to nonviolent, largely progressive demonstrators and activists in the streets across Syria. So the point is that Iran's response to the Syrian uprising, it likes to frame it as an anti-extremist, but there were no extremists. It was on the side of the oppressive dynastic dictatorship in Damascus, the Assad regime, one of the most brutal and torturous police states in the region. It was on the side of that regime against the nonviolent uprising. But ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, and these different jihadi groups that did in fact emerge and gain traction, sadly, this was actually a godsend to the Islamic Republic because it allowed it to frame its role, its intervention in Syria, as a response to extremism rather than what it actually was, which was siding with a brutal regime that happens to be its main ally in the region against a popular uprising. So we can go into that further if you're interested. But in Iraq in 2019, now Iran's role in Iraq goes it precedes 2019 because the Islamic Republic actually helped, along with the United States, interestingly, helped create the post-Saddam, post-2003, post-US invasion, the new Iraq that emerges after that political earthquake. This new Iraq was very much engineered by basically Tehran and Washington. They're the two main allies on the world stage of this new regime. But to flash forward to 2019, in October of 2019, there was what was Iraqis called the Tishreen uprising, or the October Revolution, Tishreen meaning October in Arabic. And this was, in the words of the Iraqi feminist sociologist Zahra Ali, the biggest grassroots socio-political mobilization in Iraq's history. And it was at root about the poor, the disempowered, and the marginalized demanding a new system. And so what does Iran do in the face of this huge mobilization, this grassroots uprising against this corrupt and authoritarian and repressive Iraqi state? Iran sends in paramilitary forces that it helped train. It unleashes its repressive state apparatus and opens fire. There was a total bloodbath with hundreds of Iraqi protesters, unarmed Iraqi protesters killed and many others injured. There was a series of assassinations against Iraqi activists following the immediate uprising. Iran, again, is clearly on the side of a repressive regime while it's mowing down protesters and crushing a popular uprising rather than on the side of the people doing the protesting. And in Lebanon, you have in some ways, the most indirect case, because Iran didn't play such a direct role in crushing the uprising, which started at exactly the same time, October 2019, huge popular uprising in Lebanon that rocks the country to its foundations. Iran doesn't play nearly as direct a role, so I won't spend as much time talking about that, but I will simply say that Iran's key ally in Lebanon is, of course, Hezbollah. Hezbollah is also part of this mythical axis of resistance ideology, but Hezbollah is decidedly on the side of the ruling class and the establishment, of which it is a central element. In fact, Hezbollah is part of the governing class and the ruling class of Lebanon. And Iran denounces, along with Hezbollah, denounces these protests, this uprising in Lebanon, and sides with its ally Hezbollah, which in fact unleashed some of its thugs to even beat protesters. There's an excellent new book that just came out on the Lebanese uprising of 2019, edited by Jeffrey Karam and Rima Majed, two progressive scholars in Beirut. So I highly recommend that. But in any case, to wrap up, the picture that emerges when you look at in concrete detail at Iran's role in these three theaters of Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Its response to popular uprisings, its response to democratic mobilizations. The picture that emerges is the opposite of this myth of Iran as a revolutionary state leading an axis of resistance across the region. The Iranian writer Arash Azizi characterizes Iran's response to the uprisings as follows. Tehran would orient itself to the Arab Spring not in the spirit of revolutionary fraternity, but with cold calculation worthy of a scheming monarch. Despite the words that came out of his mouth, Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, Khamenei was now more of a sultan than a revolutionary. The Islamic Republic is out not to foster revolutions against dictators, but to preserve its own regime and spread its influence by any means necessary. And along these same lines, the Iranian American journalist Borzu Daragahi, who writes for The Independent, observes that the so-called revolutionary slogans of Iran's so-called resistance are empty rhetoric that merely back whatever policies benefit the corrupt ruling elite in Tehran. And in this same vein, Yuan Stein, an international relations theorist in the UK, argues that this so-called axis of resistance, ostensibly dedicated to furthering the emancipatory aspirations of the Arab and Muslim masses, has in reality played a critical role in containing regional revolution and preventing the emergence of a more democratically oriented regional order. So I'll stop there. I'll just suggest, I'll close with a suggestion, which is that from now on, whenever you hear this term, axis of resistance, whenever you hear the Islamic Republic of Iran referred to as a revolutionary state, I suggest that this be challenged, because Iran is in fact a counter-revolutionary state at this point. One can argue, some say that it has always been a counter-revolutionary state since the Khomeinists seized the upper hand in the consolidation, the war of position in post-revolutionary Iran, crushing its leftist adversaries amongst the revolutionary coalition that brought down the Pahlavi monarchy. But the point, one can debate whether the Islamic Republic was ever a revolutionary regime in any sense. I'm bracketing that debate for purposes of my argument, which is to say, whatever one view, whether one believed that the Islamic Republic was briefly a revolutionary state, domestically, externally, what have you, it doesn't matter. At this point, it is crystal clear and unambiguously the case that it is a counter-revolutionary force in the region. And I think one of the big challenges that we have is to challenge this narrative, this zombie category of Iran as a revolutionary state and the myth of the axis of resistance. The Lebanese leftist podcaster and writer Joey Ayoub has a marvelous formulation. He talks about Hezbollah's resistance, with a capital RTM trademark, Hezbollah's resistance against resistance, actual resistance. It is in fact at war with, as is the Islamic Republic, at war with the truly emancipatory forces in the region today. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. Thank you to all the speakers. We are now going to open up for just discussion. So if you're watching on Facebook, you'll have to come onto the Zoom, which should be in the comments, in order to join the discussion, because this part won't be live streamed. So in this